The music was playing, my dress was perfect, and the love of my life stood waiting at the altar. But as I scanned the crowd, 2 seats sat empty, my parents. While everyone whispered excuses, I already knew the truth. They were sipping cocktails in Hawaii. And the gift they left behind? It would change my entire life and theirs in ways they never imagined. If you've ever been betrayed by the very people who were supposed to stand by you, smash that like button right now. Subscribe for more stories of justice and sweet revenge, because today's tale is one of the most shocking and satisfying I've ever told. My name is Bella Carter, and I spent my whole life dreaming of one day walking down the aisle in a white dress, surrounded by everyone I loved. Like most little girls, I used to watch wedding movies and imagine my dad proudly taking my arm, my mom fussing with my veil, and both of them smiling as if their years of sacrifice had finally blossomed into this single, perfect moment. But here's the thing about dreams. Sometimes they turn into nightmares. I had been engaged to Daniel for nearly 2 years. He wasn't just my fiancé. He was my best friend, my rock, the person who believed in me when no one else did. We weren't rich, but we worked hard. We picked up extra shifts, skipped vacations, and poured our savings into planning a modest but beautiful wedding. It wasn't about extravagance. It was about love, about celebrating with family and friends. And the 2 people I counted on most, my parents, were supposed to be front and center. My mom had even made a whole show of shopping for a pastel blue dress, parading it around our living room, and bragging to her friends about how classy she'd look. My dad teased me constantly about needing to practice his dance moves for the reception. I thought they were proud. I thought they were excited. Looking back, I wonder how I didn't see it, the way my mom always had a slightly dismissive tone when I mentioned details, or the way my dad joked about all the fuss for just one day. I brushed it off as nerves, as them not wanting me to stress. But in reality, they weren't taking it seriously. They weren't taking me seriously. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mom said something that still echoes in my mind. We were sitting in the kitchen, her sipping coffee while I went over seating charts. She sighed dramatically and said, half laughing, "Don't be surprised if we sneak off to Hawaii instead of your reception." I laughed too back then. I thought she was joking. Who would actually miss their daughter's wedding? Apparently, my parents would. The morning of my wedding, everything felt like a dream. My bridesmaids were buzzing around me, zipping up my dress, fixing curls in my hair, whispering how gorgeous I looked. I was nervous, but excited. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. My heart skipped, assuming it was her saying she and Dad were on their way. Instead, the words burned into me like acid. "Sorry, honey. Flight was cheaper today. We're already on our way to Hawaii. But don't worry, we left a gift." For a second, I thought it was a prank. My hands went cold, trembling so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I read it again. And again. My bridesmaid asked if I was okay, but my throat locked up. My stomach twisted violently, while rising in my throat. A gift. That's what they thought would replace being there. That's what they thought would cover the gaping hole they left in my life. As if money or some wrapped box was equal to walking me down the aisle. As if sipping cocktails on a beach mattered more than the daughter they raised. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My hands were shaking so hard that my phone slipped, clattering to the floor. My maid of honor bent to pick it up, but I snatched it before she could read the message. No one needed to see the proof of just how disposable I was to my parents. When the ceremony began, the whispers started almost immediately. The music was soft and beautiful, but it couldn't drown out the murmurs. Guests shifting in their seats, looking around, eyebrows raised. I heard fragments. Where are her parents? Didn't they RSVP? Maybe they're running late? They weren't late. They were gone. My dad's chair sat empty. My mom's seat, carefully marked at the front, stared back at me like a cruel joke. I wanted to crumble to cry, but the music swelled and I had to walk. Without a father to take my arm, Daniel's best man, Evan, offered his instead. I clutched it, each step heavier than the last, the weight of betrayal pressing harder than my dress or veil ever could. Daniel looked at me with so much love that for a moment, it dulled the ache. But I couldn't stop glancing at those 2 chairs. Even as I said my vows, Even as we exchanged rings, they screamed louder than the violinist's melody. At the reception, I tried to push it aside. To laugh, to dance, to pretend. But the shadow of their absence followed me everywhere. It grew heavier when the maid of honor stood for her toast. She clinked her glass, smiled nervously, and said, "To Bella and Daniel, may your love always be stronger than excuses. Even if some people would rather be in Hawaii." The room erupted into awkward laughter. My cheeks burned. My humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was on full display, wrapped in pity and whispers. I felt exposed, like everyone could see the gaping wound inside me. And then came the final blow. When Daniel and I opened their so-called gift, the room fell quiet again. Inside the envelope was a check for $5,000. My mom's sharp handwriting scrawled across the card, "This should cover your little wedding. Have fun, little." As if my marriage was small. As if my happiness was insignificant. I stared at that check until the words blurred. My chest ached like something inside me had cracked open. That was the moment something shifted. Humiliation curdled into something sharper. Into resolve. Into the quiet, burning seed of revenge. After the wedding, the whispers never stopped. Friends tried to be kind, saying things like, "At least you had a beautiful day," or "They'll regret it someday." But I saw the pity in their eyes. I knew what they were really thinking. Her own parents didn't bother to show up. Every time I replayed the moment of walking down the aisle, those empty chairs burned in my mind. My dad should have been there to hold my arm steady, but he wasn't. My mom should have been crying happy tears, but she was probably sipping Mai Tais on a Hawaiian beach. The shame was suffocating. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, replaying their text, that cruel line about their gift. The check for $5,000 sat untouched in my desk drawer, like a scar I couldn't bring myself to throw away. Daniel noticed. One night, he pulled me close and said, "Bella, they made their choice. But you, we get to choose what happens next." I whispered back, "But they're my parents. How do I get over that?" He stroked my hair, his voice steady. "You don't get over it. You move through it. And maybe one day you show them they chose wrong." Those words stuck in my head. Show them they chose wrong. That was the first spark of something I hadn't felt since the humiliation. Power. At first, I buried myself in work. Daniel and I had talked for years about starting a small catering company, but we'd always been afraid. Afraid of failing, afraid of not having the support we needed. But now, I had nothing left to lose. If my own parents could abandon me, then what was the point of waiting for anyone's approval? We took the leap. Our kitchen became our battlefield. Early mornings, late nights, recipes tested until our fingers ached and our clothes smelled permanently of garlic and rosemary. We cooked for anyone who would hire us. Birthday parties, tiny corporate luncheons, even church picnics. Every event felt like a test, and every compliment was a victory. And every time I felt like giving up, I saw that check in my mind. "This should cover your little wedding." Those words became my fuel. But success didn't come easily. Some clients ghosted us after tastings. Others criticized our food as too ambitious. There were nights when Daniel and I collapsed into bed too exhausted to speak, only to wake up and do it all again. And yet, something inside me refused to break. For the first time in my life, I didn't want to impress my parents. I wanted to prove them wrong. One memory in particular drove me forward. The week before the wedding, I'd been gushing about our plans, how I couldn't wait for them to see me walk down the aisle. My mom had looked at me and smirked. "Don't set your expectations too high, Bella. Big moments have a way of letting people down." She hadn't been warning me. She'd been foreshadowing her own betrayal. That memory burned. It hardened me. It made me promise myself that I would never again give them the power to define my worth. Months turned into a year. Slowly, our reputation grew. Clients began recommending us. Word spread that our food wasn't just good, it was unforgettable. We secured a contract with a local art gallery, then a law firm, then a hotel. And every small success felt like a brick in the empire I was building. Meanwhile, my parents were silent. Not a single call, not a single word of apology. Just the occasional Instagram post of them sipping cocktails in exotic places. Smiling, relaxed, as if missing my wedding had been nothing more than skipping a dentist appointment. It wasn't until year 2 of our business that I heard from them again. Out of the blue, my phone buzzed with a message from my mom. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart. We always knew you had it in you. We'd love to catch up soon. Maybe over dinner? Your dad has been having a rough time with his investments. We could use some of your advice." Advice. That was the word she used. Not apology. Not sorry for abandoning you. No acknowledgement of the wound they had carved into me. Just a sugar-coated request for help. I stared at the message for hours, my hands shaking with rage. They hadn't even mentioned my wedding. They hadn't mentioned the humiliation, the pain. Just themselves. Their needs. Their struggles. And for the first time, instead of feeling crushed by their selfishness, I felt calm. Clear. They had made me small once. But I wasn't small anymore. The girl who once cried over empty chairs was gone. In her place stood a woman who had built something of her own, brick by brick, plate by plate. And for the first time, I realized, maybe revenge wasn't about screaming or slamming doors. Maybe it was about power. About showing them that the daughter they once dismissed had risen so high, they couldn't even reach me anymore. That was the night I made my decision. I wasn't going to ignore them. I wasn't going to lash out in anger. No, I was going to plan something so precise, so cutting, that they would finally feel the weight of what they had done. And they would regret every cocktail, every palm tree, every smug smile they had chosen over me. The first dinner with my parents after years of silence felt like walking into enemy territory. I agreed to meet them at a fancy restaurant downtown, one I knew they could no longer afford. The maitre d' led me to the table, and there they were. My mother in her pastel blue dress, the same one she had once bragged she'd wear to my wedding, and my father forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Bella," my mom exclaimed, standing as if we were long-lost best friends. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled faintly of cheap perfume and desperation. "Oh, sweetheart, you look amazing. We've missed you so much." I forced a polite smile. "Really? Because you didn't seem to miss me on my wedding day." Her face froze, just for a second, before she smoothed it over with a laugh. "Oh, honey, that was such a mix-up. You know how life gets. But look at you now, so successful. We always knew you'd make it. Always knew." The words were like sandpaper against my skin. Dad cleared his throat, his voice low and hesitant. "We've had some financial setbacks. Investments that didn't pan out. We were hoping you could give us some advice. Maybe even help us get back on track." And there it was, the real reason they'd reached out. Not love. Not guilt. Not even curiosity about my life. They needed money. For a moment, I almost laughed. The irony was delicious. They had skipped my wedding for cocktails on the beach, and now here they were, empty-handed, looking to me for salvation. But instead of lashing out, I smiled sweetly. "Of course. Let me think about how I can help." Inside, my mind was already racing. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, Daniel's arm draped across me. "They're broke," I whispered into the darkness. "They want me to save them." Daniel's voice was calm, steady. "So, what are you going to do?" I turned my head toward him, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I'm going to give them exactly what they deserve." From that moment, my plan began to take shape. Over the next few weeks, my parents kept popping up like weeds. They called constantly, acting overly affectionate. My mom left voicemails dripping with false sweetness, just checking in on my favorite daughter. My dad tried to sound supportive. "So proud of you, kiddo. You've really made a name for yourself." But beneath the honeyed words, I could hear the hunger, the desperation. They weren't trying to reconnect. They were circling, waiting for me to throw them a financial lifeline. Meanwhile, their problems grew more obvious. Friends of the family whispered about foreclosure notices, unpaid debts, and investments that had gone belly up. Their Hawaii trips had drained them dry, and their pride kept them from admitting it to anyone but me. And I played the part of the dutiful daughter. I listened patiently. I nodded sympathetically. I even invited them to one of our catering events, a corporate gala where I knew they'd see me commanding respect, overseeing an entire staff, running a business that was flourishing without them. When they arrived, overdressed as usual, my mother gasped as she saw the sheer scale of the event. Chandeliers sparkled above, tables draped in silk gleamed under the lights, and waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays of food that Daniel and I had perfected through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. "This is incredible," my dad muttered, eyes wide. "All this? You did all this?" I smiled. "Yes. Without your help." I watched the flicker in his eyes, the recognition that I no longer needed him. That maybe, just maybe, he now needed me. And that flicker was intoxicating. The more they tried to ingratiate themselves, the clearer my revenge became. They wanted to pretend the past never happened. They wanted me to ignore the humiliation, the betrayal, the check that reduced my wedding to something little. But I hadn't forgotten. I would never forget. One evening, my mom called, her voice chipper. "Sweetheart, we were thinking, maybe you could come over this weekend? We'll make dinner like old times. We'd love to talk about how you might invest in us. Maybe even help us buy back the house." I almost choked on my tea. Buy back the house? The sheer audacity made my skin crawl. Instead, I said, "Sure. Let's talk about it. But I have a better idea. Why don't you come to one of my biggest events yet? A wedding we're catering for a billionaire client. I'd love for you to see what we've built." Her delight was immediate. "Oh, Bella, that sounds perfect. We'll be there, darling. You'll see, we're a family again." Family. The word tasted bitter. But I smiled anyway, because the stage was almost set. In the days leading up to that event, I prepared not just for the wedding, but for my moment. My revenge wouldn't come with shouting matches or slammed doors. No, my revenge would come dressed in silk, bathed in chandeliers, wrapped in applause. For years, I had carried the weight of those empty chairs, of whispers and humiliation. But now I was ready to return the favor. My parents had left me on the most important day of my life. Now I would make sure they remembered it for the rest of theirs. The venue smelled like roses and warm perfume, with a faint undercurrent of butter and caramel from the dessert station. Crystal chandeliers trembled with reflected light. The band tuned in a corner. Guests floated through the ballroom like polished planets orbiting a glittering sun. This was the kind of wedding that made magazine editors salivate. Marble floors, towering floral arrangements, tables named after continents. It was everything my parents had ignored for my day and everything I had sweated to create for others. I wore a slate gray suit that made me feel smaller and sharper at once. Daniel moved through the crowd, his presence steady. Our staff performed like a single organism. I had rehearsed this night 1,000 times in my head, not with a script of revenge so much as a choreography of dignity. If I was going to punish them, it would be with the thing they had always underestimated: my composure. My parents arrived late, exactly as I predicted, breathless, overdressed, trying to soak in the grandeur like tourists at a museum. My mother's pastel blue dress clung to her like a memory. My father's tie was slightly askew, the look of a man who'd forgotten how to be in a room where he wasn't the star. "Oh, Bella," my mother cried, planning a kiss that felt rehearsed. "This is simply divine. We're so proud." They were on the VIP list. Of course they were. I had put their names there. Let them feel the privilege for a minute. Let them taste the illusion. I moved past them without letting my expression crack. "Welcome," I said, the word cool as a knife wrapped in satin. "I'm glad you could make it." They smiled, and the smile looked fragile up close. Through the glass of a champagne flute, my father's face seemed smaller than it had in photos. The ceremony passed in a shimmer of vows and teary eyes. The couple looked luminous. I kept one eye on the tables, one on the staff, and one on my parents. When it was time for the toasts, the billionaire groom, a man with a voice like velvet and enough money to bail entire countries, stood and raised his glass. He didn't know my story. He only knew that he trusted me to orchestrate perfection. He spoke of love and fate, of humble beginnings and grand futures. The room applauded, a wave of noise that felt almost muscle-like. And then, the moment I had carved out for them. Not malicious. Not messy. Surgical. I had arranged with the client and the event manager weeks earlier a small segment in the program, a charitable component. The groom wanted to help a local family in need as a wedding gesture. He'd asked me to curate the recipient beneficiaries. I'd agreed and selected a few worthy causes. Among them, I had included an innocuous-sounding family recovery fund, a name that would sound philanthropic in print but sting in practice. When he announced the fund and asked the representative to come forward, I saw my parents straighten, hope sparking in their eyes like a moth to light. They leaned in, animated, mouths ready to form thank yous that had never come when it would have mattered. The representative stepped up, a poised woman from the charity, and began to speak about community, resilience, and the importance of accountability in giving. Tonight, she said, the couple has chosen to honor the idea that charity should reflect responsibility. We will publicly present the nominees and select those whose actions align with the values of the organization. My parents' expressions softened into anticipation. For the first time since the reception at my wedding, they believed they might be welcomed back into a story that excluded them. I watched the color drain from my mother's face when the representative read the list aloud. Their names were there, not as beneficiaries but as a case study. On the screen behind her, a tasteful slideshow appeared, photos of family moments, dates, and then, beneath a tasteful sepia wash, a caption I had written with careful cruelty, choosing vacation over daughter, a case of priorities. Somewhere in the back, a fork paused midair. A hush stitched through the room like a seam tearing. My mother opened her mouth and closed it. My father's jaw tightened. You could see the thought process. This must be a mistake, run like static across their faces. The charity rep continued in a steady professional voice. We believe in helping families who build community, rather than breaking it. Tonight we highlight examples of where actions and words must align. While we will not name private details, we will encourage dialogue about responsibility and restitution. She smiled, and it was the gentlest reprimand I'd ever arranged. My parents felt exposed in a room full of strangers who suddenly knew more than they should. Whispers multiplied like tiny splinters. People looked at them the way you look at a painting that's been hung in the wrong frame. I saw my father reach for his napkin, to cover something, his face, his shame, maybe a bill that would not pay. My mother's mascara blurred as she blinked too fast. They had expected the spotlight to shine flattering warmth. Instead, it illuminated cracks. After the formalities, guests milled toward dessert and small talk. My parents tried to steer conversation, to preen their way around the repercussion. But the tone had changed. Where there had been envying murmurs earlier, there was now a cautious distance. People who seized the opportunity to gawk did so surreptitiously, their compassion thin as tissue. Later, when people approached me with compliments about the service and the food, they asked quietly about the charity segment. Was that planned? One woman asked, eyes flicking toward my parents. My answer was a non-committal smile that tasted like vinegar. The final act of my careful revenge was not public shaming or a scandal. It was an invitation wrapped in a boundary. A week after the wedding, I called them to offer help, but on my terms. I invited them to meet for an accounting of their needs, to walk them through professional steps that would require dignity and transparency, structured budgets, credit counseling, and community repayment plans. Help, but with responsibility. When they arrived to my office, which smelled faintly of lemon oil and fresh linen, a room that represented every late night and sacrifice, they expected a tearful reunion. They found instead a spreadsheet on the table, neatly labeled, repayment plan, terms and conditions. Under assistance, I typed, contingent upon public acknowledgement of past negligence and completion of community restitution. I slid the bill-sized copy of the torn check across the table, the exact check they had written to me on my wedding day and that I had taped back together, bold red letters at the top read, returned. My mother's hands trembled. Bella, please, she started, voice small. I looked at her, and for the first time I let the truth fully land. You left me an empty chair and a check that called my life little. You drank my ties when I needed you. You were not there for me when you should have been. This is not about money. It's about accountability. If you want help, real help, it will be earned. My father swallowed hard and was silent. The silence was heavier than any apology. They had watched me build an empire of plates and promises, and tonight they had watched it sparkle without them. They had reached for the illusion of belonging and found the architecture of integrity. It hurt more than any shouting ever could. That night, I closed the file and walked them to the door. "You can choose to do the work," I said softly. "Or you can keep sipping cocktails while the people you hurt grow up without you." They left with more than empty hands. They left with the knowledge that what they had given me could not be repaid with a whim. The wound remained, but the throne I'd built atop it felt secure. In the weeks after the billionaire's wedding, word spread quietly but steadily. No newspaper articles or scandal blogs. Nothing that would make headlines. But in the circles my parents once thrived in, whispers carried faster than ink. Friends who used to vacation with them now kept their distance. Neighbors who once admired their trips abroad began to see the cracks. My parents had always cared about appearances more than reality. And appearances now were poisoned. They called a few times after the event. The first time, my mom's voice was sharp with anger. "How could you humiliate us like that? We're your parents." I let her words hang in the silence before answering calmly, "Parents don't abandon their daughter on her wedding day. That's what you are, people who share my blood. But parents show up." The line went dead. The next call came weeks later, softer, broken. My dad's voice cracked as he admitted they were losing their house. He didn't ask for money this time. Just said, "We don't know what to do." For the first time, I felt a flicker of something like pity, but it wasn't strong enough to overwrite the years of dismissal, the empty chairs, the check that belittled my marriage. I didn't gloat. I didn't scold. I simply told him, "You'll figure it out." Like I did. And then I hung up. Because the truth was, revenge wasn't about watching them drown. It wasn't about punishing them forever. It was about reclaiming my power. And I had already done that. Daniel reminded me one night, as we sat on our balcony sipping wine after another successful event, "You don't owe them more pain, Bella. You already took back your story." He was right. For so long, their betrayal had defined me. But now it no longer did. The wound hadn't disappeared, but it had hardened into something else. Strength. Clarity. I thought back to my wedding day. The 2 empty chairs, the whispers, the humiliation. For years, I let those images haunt me. But now I realized those empty seats weren't symbols of abandonment. They were reminders that I had stood on my own and survived. My parents had chosen cocktails over commitment, vacations over vows, comfort over their child. That choice belonged to them. And its consequences belonged to them too. What belonged to me was everything I built afterward. The catering empire, the respect, the love I shared with Daniel, the life we created without their shadow looming over us. One afternoon, I found the torn check in my desk drawer, the one I had handed back to them at the event. I stared at the jagged line where I'd taped it together, at the word "returned" written in red across the top. For the first time, I didn't feel anger when I looked at it. I felt peace. I slipped it into a folder labeled "Archive" and put it away, not as a wound but as proof of survival. Proof that I had turned pain into power. My parents faded into the background of my life after that. I heard through whispers that they sold their house, moved into a smaller place, tried to rebuild. Maybe one day they'll learn humility. Maybe not. But that's not my responsibility anymore. Because in the end, revenge didn't come from tearing them down. It came from rising higher than they ever thought I could. From showing them and myself that their absence didn't define me. My strength did. Sometimes the people we expect to stand beside us are the ones who vanish when it matters most. That betrayal can cut deeper than words. But it doesn't have to be the end of your story. My parents chose Hawaii over me. I chose to rise without them. And in the end, that was the sweetest revenge of all. If this story gave you chills, hit that like button right now. And tell me in the comments, would you forgive parents who skipped your wedding, or would you let them face the consequences? Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this, because trust me, the best revenge is always yet to come.